Welcome. This will be my video on the 2008 movie The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. I am going to start with a review with zero spoilers for the movie and the book, and then get into a thoughts section discussion of, particularly the movie. I will also talk some about the book, but I will verbally let you know before I get into any spoilers, before the section that has full spoilers. And the movie is rated PG-13, so will this video be. And this is a movie that I find fascinating in a way. I can't exactly claim I love it. And yeah, before I go further, I wanted to say I really loved the video by Big Joel. As usual, great. He tends to make, such about the movie and book. I'm going to try not to restate here what he said there. I haven't watched it since that video first came out, so it's possible I will accidentally say something that he also did. From what I recall, I didn't really disagree with anything he said in the video. If I don't forget, because I am recording it earlier, I am intending to release this video on Holocaust Remembrance Day. This is not a decision I take lightly, and as usual for these, when I dedicate a video to a movie or show that is about a historical tragedy, I don't intend for there to be any jokes here. This is a movie bookend movie, that perhaps especially through the reception, in part also just the fact that they were even made in the first place, made in the way that they are, really communicates a lot to us, perhaps unintentionally so, about how important for empathy is how something serious is first communicated to someone, and perhaps also when. I've seen people who defend the book and movie, and a substantial percentage of them are children who have been taught about the Holocaust at an early age and found a lot of the material to be too intense, which I can appreciate. I remember being a kid and learning about horrible things in history, but the Holocaust is one of those things that you just can't teach without confronting it. And while this movie does a at least slightly better job, pushing about as far as it can with the PG-13, at least for 2008, the book really holds back entirely too much. And I do want to make it clear, I really don't think that either of these were made to downplay, much less whitewash. They clearly are against the Nazis, as we all should be. But the amount of information and the framing of it really affect how I will talk some, but it contains spoilers for book and movie. So in the spoiler section, I will get into some of the reactions to these two versions of this story. And personally, I think that actually does slot very nicely onto, and longtime viewers know this was coming, the genocide of Palestinians currently being carried out by the Israeli government in Gaza. Now, it's very important for me to underline, while I am anti-Zionist, I am not anti-Semitic. I have no problem with Jewish people as, like, on principle. it is Zionism I take issue with. And yes, there are a number of Zionist Jews. I believe we can reach at least a substantial chunk of them. The ones who have directly been indoctrinated by Israel, sometimes in Israel, the ones who continue to live in Israel, despite, like, at this point, everyone knows it's impossible to avoid, and I'm not saying it would be good to avoid the truth of the genocide. And no, not a war. I cannot stand when it is referred to as a war. Not all Zionists are Jewish. Some of them are tremendously more anti-Semitic than, many others. Some of them are, belong to one or more Christian. Well, yeah, I believe there's more than one Christian sect that think that if, Jewish people are not in control of Jerusalem, then Jesus will not return, and they're looking forward to him returning because they believe he will kill all the Jewish people. That is tremendously more, that is actually anti-Semitic, criticizing the government. It would be anti-Semitic if you said that someone who is Jewish must by definition agree with the genocide. Some of the most vocal voices against the genocide are Jewish people. And that's something that should be encouraged. Listen, everybody, you don't choose to be born, for example, Jewish. I didn't choose to be born a cishet white man. We have to speak out against horrible things that happen or carried out sometimes in our names, and with like gesturing towards it. Like, I try to speak out against white supremacy and misogyny because so many cishet white men will insist, oh, well, we're doing this for the white race. Listen, do not put that on me. I did not ask for that. It does not serve me or anyone else. It serves the rich, nobody else. And the rich are the ones we should actually be criticizing. I'm not calling for violence. I'm saying politically, democratically. There are so many things in this book movie and the reaction to them that slots so perfectly onto the genocide being carried out in Gaza by the IDF. It really is still painful to realize how much all these efforts to try to keep the Holocaust from happening again, so much of it has been ignored to the point, there is still tremendous anti-Semitism. And for so many people, I'm afraid my wrists are too sore to look up it or anything else right now. I believe what was said was never again about the Holocaust, after the Holocaust. And sadly, for some people, that doesn't seem to mean at all. It just seems to mean to Jewish people. There are people who think that it is okay as long as it's Jewish people carrying it out against someone else. Like, I think some of the people who are responsible and some people who just support it, the way they talk about the genocide, although they of course don't call it that, in Gaza, many of them don't, it is very clear that this is an attempt to get revenge for the Holocaust, which I 100% understand. I'm not Jewish myself. I cannot even imagine how it must be to be told that your people were attempted exterminated, and so many Jewish people, like, if any Jewish person still alive today, like, was, the vast majority of Jewish people living today were told after it happened, and many when they were children. I understand the logic in doing so, wanting to impress upon them. It's not dissimilar from, there's a number of African American parents who, teach their kids to, tell them how to behave around cops because they're worried that the cops will brutalize, maybe even kill them, perhaps even before they come of age. So I do appreciate why many, I'm not telling anyone they shouldn't want revenge for the Holocaust, but that wasn't Palestinians. It wasn't Muslims at all. Those were white Christians. Yes, Gott mit uns. They were Christians, or at the very least claimed to be doing it in the name of Jesus Christ, were following a history of anti-Semitism within Christianity. And it is in part because some of the people who orchestrated this genocide that's being carried out in Gaza knew, if you want, there's a lot of white Christians. If you want them on your side, you cannot be focusing on how the people who carried out the Holocaust were Christians and white. So they had to choose another target. And honestly, the Tabernacle does a fantastic job talking about how all this, came to be. I recommend his videos rather than me trying to simply remember. He has done significantly more research into this. So I want to also acknowledge that not everything about the book and movie are bad. I will try to discuss some of the aspects where one can at least appreciate what they're trying to do. So starting with the writing. So the core setup here is that, during the Holocaust, Bruno, a German 8-year-old, moves to near a concentration camp, and there are no other, children. Like, there's his older sister, but she's 12 and does not really want to play anymore. So when he, not understanding that it is a concentration camp, goes to the fence and finds a young Jewish boy, Shmuel, same age, sitting there, become friends, despite not being able to, there is the fence between them. He is the titular boy in pajamas, striped pajamas. And basically the movie, the book and movie explore how Bruno just doesn't quite understand and struggles to the reality that the Holocaust was, and setting aside the various leaps in logic and historical inaccuracies required to even have, this core scenario happen as it does. One of the problems here is that this focuses on this Aryan boy rather than centering Jewish people, and that had a tremendous effect on how it was perceived by some of the children who read the book. And this idea that an 8-year-old, obviously one of the major themes here is this contrast between the innocence, perceived or real, of childhood contrasted with the horrors of the Nazi regime. And there are some strong images that manage to imply rather than show, since PG-13, and it is genuinely, hypothetically, a noteworthy idea to teach children about the Holocaust through a story that tells it through a child's eyes. And it really does remind me of how you see people talking about Palestinians as if they're not human, as if they are just fundamentally different. You know, Asmongold had some choice words which I really don't want to repeat. He of the dead rat carcass alarm clock, saying that other people are inherently inferior because he's a cishet white man. Culture has told him since he was little that he is just inherently better. And part of it is that now, one of the major things that really turned around, we are seeing there is a lot of people now. I forget the exact number, and it's also been a little while since I saw. I don't remember. I'm not sure I even know the most up-to-date statistics, but a lot of people are now against the genocide being carried out in Gaza by the Israeli government. And one of the things that really helped turn the tide were all these images of children. Some of them injured by the weapons that had been claimed to only be used against adults, and the, dangerous male ones at that. You cannot really unsee a mother clinging to her injured child and have people say that somehow they deserve that. You can't really see things the same way again ever after that. Images of suffering children are part of how some of these really turn public opinion on something. And, through Shmuel, you do hypothetically have that here. And there are also other, I don't know if it's a spoiler, I'll just keep it vague and say other, like some of the most prominent movies dealing with the Holocaust feature at least one child to really underline the historical fact that children were also victims of the Holocaust. There is some psychological accuracy and authenticity here. Some of it, they do play fast and loose in order for the story to happen and for it to happen the way that it does. In the book particularly, Bruno is very annoyingly naive in a way that feels forced. It feels like the author, who I don't have much... I'm not sure I have really anything to say about him that Big Joel didn't already cover. But it feels like he doesn't remember what it's like being a child. He just has this, like, rose-tinted glasses idea. So to be clear, I'm not saying that the children in book or movie here are, like, perfect little angels or something, but it seems like the author thinks that, novel author thinks that the children understand less than they do, which I think it would work okay if there was some acknowledgement, like, listen, I don't know, maybe Bruno is, maybe he has a learning disability. I don't want to be insensitive about that, but as far as I can tell, that isn't really the idea. It is just this, honestly, caricature of how a child perceives the world around them. And I think that takes a lot of power out of it. It feels almost like he's trying to reach out of the book and pat on the head any child reading it and tell them, you wouldn't have been evil if you lived through that. You would just not have understood. But now that you're reading in a book, you can understand, because you'll talk to the teacher, you'll talk to other people who know, and you'll come to understand, and it's okay. And I think the idea of a story about the Holocaust trying to be reassuring, as this, like, there's a part in the book which I will talk about in the spoiler section where it spells out, yes, we are trying to reassure kids. I think that's just a fundamentally wrong way to try to teach about something so horrible. But it is definitely a story, particularly the movie, that is interested in the way different people process a similar situation, even if different perspectives affect it. And at times it is even successful in accomplishing it. The level of detail is quite good. There are a lot of little things that convey more than you might at first realize. There is this... We're told early on that Bruno wants to be an explorer. He wants to go on adventures. Before they move to near the concentration camp, they live in Berlin, and he has several friends. They play war. They pretend to be airplanes. They run around doing finger guns, pretending to be shooting each other, pretending to be hit and falling over and such. And at one point, they fly their airplanes. They're running around with their arms outstretched. They run right past Jewish people being loaded onto a truck, and they pay it no mind. And this idea of German regular people being that close to the Holocaust and not really thinking about it is a major theme in both book and movie. And there are times where it really does kind of work, because the thing is, and this is something we've seen recently, in part in the Gaza Strip, in part in America via ICE. There are people who will just stand by. Now, I'm not talking about the Palestinians. I'm talking about Israeli citizens and Zionists, other Zionists and such. And to be clear, I'm also not saying that every single Israeli Jewish person is Zionist. I forget the number. I appreciate that it is high. But yeah, I think that is as much as I can say about that aspect. But yeah, just recently, Kat Abu Ghazaleh, gave a speech after having been, I want to say the word is indicted, because she protested peacefully against ICE in the place that she's running for office, in the place that she lives. It's not like she went to another state and brought a gun and then shot some people over, what was it again? Thrown plastic bag, I think. And then recently tweeted threatening to do it, or promising to do it again, basically. So much for crying about having done it and regretting it and wanting to move on to something else in their life. I guess he was just thinking, well, looks like a lot of people don't like what I did right now. Should probably wait, maybe later. But Kat was giving this speech, excellent as usual, and there was a pro-ICE protester there who yelled out, "We love ICE," multiple times, prompting some in the crowd to tell her to shut up. Kat said, "No, let her speak." And at one point after she said, "We love ICE" again, Kat simply responded, "You may love ICE, but ICE doesn't love you." And that is such a pitch-perfect way to say it. And it is striking to me that there are still people who support ICE after everything. They're still killing people. ICE continues to shoot people while being filmed. And I saw that at least one ICE person recently said to another, "This is just like Call of Duty. Cool, huh?" Because that's how they see it. They don't think of their targets as human. And if you agree with them, don't assume that, like, listen, if you're native born, white, and you speak English, maybe if you have to go back a bunch of generations before your family were immigrants, because technically, if you're not a Native American, if you live in America, you are technically an immigrant. That's just the reality of it. And of course, some people can get away with it. Let's see, was it, I sometimes struggle to remember, was it Donald Trump's father or his grandfather? One of them was an immigrant to America, and I don't know. Right now, they are getting people deported who are also children of immigrants born in America. Somehow I don't think Donald himself is going to be. It's strange. It's almost hypocritical. But yeah, maybe you will be safe if your ancestry can be tracked back to, for many generations to, it was long ago that you immigrated. You might be safe from ICE, but I don't know what makes you think you'll be safe from other elements of this regime. Trump trying to turn America into the Fourth Reich. Groceries are still expensive. They're taking away healthcare, calling people domestic terrorists so that they can get away with having ICE shoot them. Because that is also the thing. Keep in mind, ICE shoots, white native-borns in America. That is a thing that happens. Not as often as the deportations of people who, at least to them, look like they don't, have citizen status, but we already know mistakes have been made, which at first they acknowledged and said they were fixing it, and then they went back on that and said, no mistakes are made. You should always question people who insist that they make no mistakes when it comes to something serious. Rather trust people who say that they're going to do their very best to not make mistakes, and if a mistake is made, they will catch it as quickly as possible and resolve it. The tone here attempts to strike a balance between these, childish notions that Bruno hangs on to, and then the harsh reality of Hitler's regime. And some of the time does a reasonable job. As an adaptation, I would definitely say, I'm not exactly saying you should go out and read or watch. But if you are just too curious, I definitely think the movie is better. And that is not something, I'm not one of those people who say, oh, the movie's got to be better. No, no, no. There are books out there that are so much better than the movie or movies made based on it. There's just something to, I forget who said it, but I read one person once saying that the written word can build a wall that nothing can break. There's nothing the written word cannot accomplish. And there is a lot of truth to that. But in the book, so I already mentioned Bruno, very annoying. There was one early part where I almost turned off the audiobook, but I was like, listen, I should finish this so that I can properly compare, but yeah, it's but other than that, the limitations really, really hurt not just the book, but also its purpose. It is less able to properly educate children simply because, in part, the choice to center it on Bruno's perspective. So everything in the book is filtered through this version of an 8-year-old, whereas the movie tends to focus on him, but there are scenes in it that he does not witness or necessarily even become aware of. And that definitely does enable them to do more. The dialogue at times feels natural, feels like the way people actually talk. And there definitely is a good amount conveyed through there. And the delivery is strong. So the direction does a lot right. There are several critical elements that are established immediately. I've already mentioned, the boys playing airplane. That's one of the very first things we see. And it immediately has us understand that in a world where Jewish people are being, sent to concentration camps, Bruno somehow is still this playful child. And the way that the resistance to the Nazi regime is just sprinkled in, like here and there you'll have a character express something, not necessarily that they are personally against it, but they will, there will be some indication of the horrors of the regime. And a number of the characters will simply say, well, that's how it has to be, this is important. And that I do really appreciate as something, I don't know if I would necessarily say an 8-year-old should watch this. Certainly it shouldn't be the only thing, should not be their first exposure to the Holocaust. But, young people watching this, so as mentioned, it's PG-13. Young people watching this, like, it is extremely important that if they see something, like when you're watching a movie and you see Jewish people being loaded onto a truck, we instinctively think that's horrible, as, that is simply what, it was horrible. And it is important to have children and teenagers question what they see and think, is this okay? Am I comfortable with this? Because so much of, perhaps especially schools in America, but I am aware also other countries, so much of it is teaching them to obey authority even when authority is objectively wrong. I remember years ago reading about there was a student that corrected the teacher in front of the class, and they weren't rude about it, but there was frustration among the teachers because they thought it was inherently wrong for a student to correct a teacher, even though they were factually accurate. And that is the kind of thing that breeds the aimless anti-authoritarianism that you sometimes see on the right. You know, people who are just against, you know, that they'll say, oh, you can't tell me to wear a mask, even though it might save lives, to, okay, let's see. The mask, I think some people said that was questionable. Let's see, washing your hands very thoroughly and using the, what's that called in English again? Antibacterial gel, you know, that helped save lives. And there were conservatives saying, you can't tell me what to do about stuff like that, and trans people and such, you know, while people are actually dying, because when they were children, these conservatives were told you have to obey authority, and they don't question, a lot of them don't, especially not enough, question conservative, you know, politicians, priests, stuff like that. They're the ones abusing their power. It's not trans people, and it's not scientists telling you, hey, if you do this, it'll save lives. If enough people don't do this, the death toll will be enormous. And it was, because a lot of people refused to listen. So I do appreciate that element in the film. And I think that does bring us to, yeah, one of the major things about this movie is that from a technical perspective, it is never less than competent, and it is at times genuinely effective. It is filmed and edited very, very well. There are images in here that really stick with you through framing, lighting, and the actual subject matter. The production value, set design, locations, costumes, and makeup are very impressive and help communicate things about the characters. You'll see Bruno's room, Gretel's room, sister, and there is a very distinct difference in someone like Shmuel and some of the other Jewish characters look like they are not doing well. It's difficult on a 2008 PG-13 to show malnourishment. They try, and there are times where, I certainly did notice that there was at least one slightly plus-size individual. He was not Jewish. He was a German military officer, and that does, and there's even another character who, points it out. And without saying the following, they were doing well, for some of it. I will acknowledge that there were times where, the war effort was difficult on them. There's always a silver lining. But the minimal though it were, obviously nowhere near as bad as the Holocaust itself. Now, I think that does cover. Yeah, the music is engaging. The sound design is good to great. There are times where you don't see something, but you hear, something that has an impact on you. as far as characters go, I do think this does a good job of having, like, the overall cast is of major characters is not huge, but there's just enough, and essentially everyone has some part to play. They do something and or reflect something, and that allows it to keep a tight focus on the central concept, flawed though it is. And the acting is really, really strong. You know, I don't have to tell you it's a stacked cast. Like, these are some of the greatest talents. And honestly, I don't think I've particularly seen them in other stuff, but even the kids are pretty good. There's not really any moment where I felt like, okay, that wasn't quite convincing. Like, there's times where they're struggling with the dialogue or characterization, but that's a writing issue. And the pacing is pretty good. It's, you know, under 90 minutes. It's like 90 minutes if you count the end credits. And as such, obviously, it has little time to be boring, but it does also strike a balance. It's neither rushing nor lingering. And that was, again, the book lingers in a way that honestly, like, felt a little bit like padding. Like, maybe there was a specific page count, word count that he had to reach. I don't know. And I think that does pretty much, yeah. I don't know. It feels a little weird to even give this a rating, but yeah. So I'm weighing the fact that it is well made. If you're just looking at, I don't think you should, the, you know, skill put into it, weighing that against it not being fully thought out and having had a detrimental impact on perceptions of the Holocaust. So yeah, I rate this 5 out of 10. And I'm going to get into the spoilers, which I call the thought section. So from here on out, I'm spoiling absolutely everything about both the book and the movie. So there, I am not going to read the entire. I found something on Wikipedia about, you know, the I'm briefly going to go over a few of the things on Wikipedia from this. Yeah, so yeah, scholars have criticized the film for obscuring the historical facts about the Holocaust, creating a false equivalent. So some of this is direct quote from Wikipedia. Between victims and perpetrators, for example, at the end of the movie, the grief of Bruno's family is depicted, encouraging the viewer to feel sympathy for Holocaust perpetrators. And yeah, Michael Gray noted, you know, stories not very realistic. Children were murdered when they arrived at Auschwitz. It was not possible for them to have contact with people on the outside. So right there, the entire concept here falls apart. And I'm not saying that that means that automatically means that a story should not be told. I think sometimes there can be something powerful. But a lot of the children who read the book, watched the movie, thought, oh, this is how it happened. And I don't think we should forget, yeah, children were murdered when they arrived at Auschwitz. That's, yeah. Let's see. Oh, right. Okay, yeah. However, according to Nazi records, there were 619 male children at the camp. All female and many other male children were gassed upon arrival. let's see, and the study by the Center for Holocaust Education, University College London, found it's having a significant and significantly problematic impact on the way young people attempt to make sense of this complex past. And there was a more recent study that found the film's reception is strongly based on the viewer's previous knowledge and beliefs. And more from Michael Gray, he found that more than 3/4 of British school children, aged 13 to 14, in his sample had engaged with the Boy in the Striped Pajamas significantly more than the Diary of Anne Frank. So the story of the white male child whose father helped carry out the Holocaust was easier to engage with for the school children than the story of the Jewish female teenager who, with her family, were hiding, trying to avoid the Holocaust. That is depressing. That says a lot about these children are clearly not very good at empathizing with people and experiences that are very different from their own. And obviously, thankfully, a lot of us have not been in a similar situation to Anne Frank. I get it. Bruno's life is more similar to their own than Anne Frank, but it's still depressing. And a number of, let's see, the children believe that, so back to Wikipedia, the children believe that the story contained a lot of useful information about the Holocaust, conveyed an accurate impression of many real-life events. The majority believed it was based on a true story. And many students drew false inferences from the film, such as assuming the Germans would not have known anything about the Holocaust because Bruno's family did not, or that the Holocaust had stopped because a Nazi child had accidentally been gassed. Other students believed the Jews had volunteered to go to the camps because they had been fooled by Nazi propaganda rather than being violently rounded up and deported. Gray recommended studying the book only after children had already learned the major facts about the Holocaust and were less likely to be misled by it. And the Birkenau State Museum and Auschwitz-Birkenau State Museum and others cited as a book film that should be avoided entirely. Recommendations were made that true accounts and works from Jewish authors should be prioritized, which, it's one of those things like, why does anyone have to say that? That's such an obvious, of course that's how it should be, but yeah. And right, there was at least one, I forget if this was a user review or a critic, but someone said, it's simply not believable that Bruno, is so incredibly sheltered he doesn't know about Jews and their second-class status. The way to fix it would have been to either be a younger child, have him have a cognitive disability. You could maybe have the family be trying to hide that from everyone else, since those were executed during the Holocaust as well. And honestly, the movie feels less like, what if a sheltered child from Nazi Germany found himself close to a Jewish boy, nothing separating them except concentration camp fence, and more like, what if a sheltered child from present-day America or England found himself that close to a Jewish boy in Nazi Germany who was in a concentration camp? A sheltered child who does not know yet about the Holocaust. I appreciate even a lot of sheltered children are taught. And again, I'm not the right person to say what age. I leave that to child psychologists and such. But it is important to know about things like this. It is important to learn about these things before you become, there's a certain point, and again, I'm not the right person to say what age, but the human brain stops processing new information in quite the same way. We become kind of set in our ways, and it's really important to get anti-fascist, anti-bigotry beliefs in there before that happens. You do see a number of adult conservatives who simply refuse to empathize with people that they were taught as children not to empathize with. And so once again, talking about what the movie feels like, That's probably the appeal too. When a child who knows very little about Nazi Germany reads this book, then it's almost as if the book is speaking directly to them. This would, of course, require, let's see. Okay, hold on. I need to read my notes better before I start talking. Yeah, I think a strong case could be made that either the book and movie should have been even more obviously fictitious, maybe even make it a present-day story, have the teacher in a classroom discuss similarities to the Holocaust, or he should have addressed the biggest historical errors. It being read as a fable means it should have clearly not reflected reality, a la La Vita è Bella, Life is Beautiful, and see, or be something that bears a similarity, goes into similar. I couldn't help but think about the Terminator franchise. That first movie. Well, let's see. I think it's especially the first and fourth movies really, make it very clear. Yeah, this is, allegory for the Holocaust. And I mean, part of it is also the R rating, but yeah, when I watch that first Terminator movie, I feel more strongly, you know, I always have this fairly high baseline of just finding it despicable when people are treated unfairly, especially to the degree of extermination and such. But yeah, the Terminator, you feel it more. And yeah, I think the following review is also a really good. So this is a user review. I find the ending disgustingly manipulative and soils the rest of the film, which otherwise is a decent yet unmemorable experience. Are we meant to be sad that a non-Jewish kid has accidentally been taken to extermination with Jewish people? The idea that is the reason people love/cry at this movie sickens me. It's okay that the thousands of Jews at that camp were incinerated, but one little non-Jewish kid gets killed too, and suddenly we have a tragedy. I'm not saying that it is inherently wrong. Back to me. Done with that review. I'm not saying that it is inherently wrong to consider the death of Nazis a tragedy. The movie Downfall does an excellent job of exploring the tragedy of deaths of people who were Nazis through and through, not because it is a bad thing for such hateful, evil people to die, but because it is such a waste. They died to spread a lot of evil when they could have gone on living and helped people instead. I'm also not saying that there's something wrong with positioning as a tragedy the death of the children of Nazis. Once again, the movie Downfall depicts the deaths of children of Nazis, some of whom express that they believe that Hitler and his cause are just, which is obviously absurd. But while the movie does bring up the Holocaust, not very much since it isn't about that, talking about Downfall, it doesn't try to say that the death of Nazi children is equivalent to the deaths of Jewish children in the Holocaust. And I think that is more or less what I had. So the last chunk of the audiobook is a 26.5-minute interview with the author and the editor, and they talk about what some people hate about the book. They talk about complicity. They point out that the actual Holocaust did have Jewish people being marched past people who did nothing on the way to the extermination, but neglect to point out that one of the biggest problems with accuracy in the book is that these people have been taught to hate Jewish people just as Bruno would have if he were a real-life person instead of this very fictitious creation. So it is this fundamental misunderstanding of the reality of the situation. Yes, it is 100% true. This has been proven, documented. There were people who saw the Jewish people being marched past. And thankfully, there are movies and shows and such, I believe also shows, I certainly remember at least one movie that acknowledges, yeah, there were regular people there were some who cheered when the Jewish people were being taken away, And you see in them very clearly, yeah, they've been indoctrinated. They hate the Jewish people. They're not just, confused. They think they understand what's happening, and through their lens, they perceive it as a good thing. So, let's see, so a little bit from the commentary track. Late in the movie, the makeup of Vera Farmiga gets toned down, underlining her sadness. The author of the book wrote it so that Bruno betrayed Shmuel when the latter's caught eating in their kitchen, because it was very important to make Bruno more of a real child, not such an angel, and it drives the rest of the events of the movie. He so badly wants to make it up to his friend. I can understand why Vera Farmiga was attracted to the script, but the role really does not deserve her talent. Her character is not complex enough. Her character has so little to do. She gets into an argument with her husband because she doesn't want Bruno to be so close to the Holocaust, and she starts drinking due to her sadness in resignation from losing that fight. That does require intensity, but not really talent. This is closer to Source Code, where she's also slumming it for the role. Not the overall movie is all that bad. She deserves roles as complex as in The Departed. When I think about movies where I can always remember that she's in them, The Departed springs to mind. This and Source Code do not. Like, if years pass between me watching these movies, and sometimes that happens, yeah, I just like, oh, right, that's that. Holy crap. Because, and it's not like I don't remember any of the cast. I never forget that Jake Gyllenhaal stars in Source Code, and The Departed, I'm not sure I've ever forgotten any of the male actors who appear in it. Most of them are given more complex, yeah. Mixed up what I was about to say. Wait, let's see. No, I don't forget that she's in The Departed. But yeah, what I'm trying to say is I don't forget any of the cast members of The Departed. But yeah, with this movie, I don't forget about David Thewlis or Rupert Friend, who, like, genuinely, yeah, it wasn't that long ago that I did The Death of Stalin, a very different movie where, yeah, so he, in a less than a decade, he played both a Nazi and a communist, a Soviet Union communist. And yeah, he's unbelievably talented. Like, between these two and then, Hitman Agent 47, where he plays the titular role, like, just amazing. I cannot get enough of watching him play. Yeah. I understand not wanting children to hear some of the more gruesome details of the Holocaust and saying they should be teenagers or adults before hearing that, but obscuring the facts to the extent that this book does is irresponsible. I think a strong case could be made that rather than telling children of the gruesome details, tell them the warning signs. Tell them to be wary when politicians single out ethnic groups, of when certain people are not allowed in certain places, because kids can understand that. You don't have to tell them what the ultimate result is. Just, yeah. I don't personally think there's anything wrong with the movie ending on a downer, even for a movie that spent so much time having an innocent perspective on such serious events. And I really don't think it makes a lot of sense to give a negative review to a movie about the Holocaust where one of the leads is a Jewish child during the Holocaust, because it has a sad ending. An argument could be made that it is in bad taste to end so abruptly on the realization that the two children were gassed and that the parents were just a little bit too late to save them. That's very Hollywood. And grief and mourning should not be used for shock value. It should be explored properly or not invoked at all. I prefer the former. I've seen a lot of people praise the movie for how it affected a lot of viewers. I agree that it can be very affecting, but that's not as difficult as it is to handle grief and mourning in a movie. I'm very happy that a lot of people responded positively to the movie, making them cry. There's too much of a culture here in the West that says that crying is wrong, especially for men. But it doesn't take a 90-minute movie with a sad ending to cry. Just watch a Pixar short. I haven't watched all of them, but some of them, wow. I haven't, I'm not sure I would say any of them are bad. Not all of them will make you cry. If you don't have access to one of those, cut an onion. A 90-minute movie with a sad ending should make you think more than cry, and some people said that that's what happened. The idea of getting empathy for the Jewish people killed in the Holocaust by having a little Aryan boy also gassed to death is kind of like trying to get misogynists to treat women better by saying, how would you like it if someone did that to your mother or sister? Not ideal, but hopefully it works. However, it's a problem to do a Holocaust story focused on the poor Aryans. There are a number of people who say that the Jewish people somehow deserve the Holocaust, which is truly ridiculous. It is impossible for... And the same goes for, right now we are seeing people saying, thankfully, gradually that number is dwindling, but there are still people who insist that Palestinians just deserve it, including, I really don't think we should forget, including Charlie Kirk. I'm not glad he's dead. I feel terrible for his kids, but that is one thing he said, and it truly is absurd. That thankfully has now been realized by many. This thing of basically trying to make Charlie Kirk their new Jesus Christ or Reichstag fire. Now, let's see. Yeah. This movie and the book it's based on choose to show the gassing only when it hurts the Aryan boy, and some people think that it matters only because it happens to an Aryan boy. It's not enough that it happens to any human being. It would be one thing if there were no historical accounts of the Holocaust, or if we were simply at our wits' end on how to educate young people about the Holocaust, but those simply are not true. This is just not the right way to approach it. I've seen at least one critic say that realistically Bruno would have hated the Jewish boy due to Hitler Youth propaganda. I think there is some perhaps tiny chance that he would have rejected that propaganda and most pretended to go along with it so he wouldn't be punished for it, keeping in mind that it was literally illegal, punishable by death, to openly criticize the Nazi Party in Nazi Germany. But I do definitely agree that the idea of 8-year-old Bruno would not have been subjected to any of the propaganda telling him to hate the Jewish people before them moving and him being taught by the tutor is completely ahistoric. And the idea that his mother would be like basically surprised by it, I'm not saying all, but there were, Nazi women who were complicit, and that again feels like this is more a story of, an 8-year-old English or American boy in 2000, the mid 2000s, yeah, like there's a lot of them where if the mother found that their 8-year-old was being taught Nazi propaganda, they would have a huge problem with it. In the DVD behind the scenes, the novelist admits that he's not a historian and that he focused on something that would inspire emotion in the audience. A deleted scene shows Bruno as seemingly the only in his immediate group of peers to not believe or even know the propagandistic concept of Jewish people supposedly being rats. I think there's some chance that the filmmakers knew better, but worried that a truly honest depiction would be too disturbing for audiences, perhaps very difficult to accept as true. And yeah, I don't know. I'm trying not to simply restate, this was just not... This was very ill-conceived. The book ends with the phrase, "Of course, all of this happened a long time ago and nothing like that could ever happen again, not in this day and age." I think the intent might be to inspire people to ensure that it won't happen again, but it's entirely too easy to interpret it to mean that it literally hasn't happened again since and won't happen again. And this idea is just incredibly important to confront and challenge. First of all, there are many other genocides. Per Wikipedia, the Political Instability Task Force estimated that 43 genocides occurred between 1956 and 2016. That is 60 years. That is almost a genocide per year on average, resulting in about 50 million deaths. And the UNHCR estimated that a further 50 million had been displaced by such episodes of violence up to 2008. Note that all of these were after Shoah, the Holocaust done by the Nazis. Stalin and Mao both killed tens of millions of their own people. In those cases, it was because they got a bad idea in their head and decided to completely change how food was handled in their country without properly thinking it through, talking to experts, leading to mass starvation. Some of these genocides are less familiar to a lot of people, in part because they happened very far away. Countless people all over the world have never directly interacted with someone who either lived in the Soviet Union or whose ancestors did. Failing that, a lot don't know that they have. It happened out of sight and out of mind for a lot of people not directly affected, and this is literally exactly the problem that the book and movie are describing and are trying to combat, and instead simply recreate. It would have been so easy for the book to end noting that this kind of thing sadly has happened many other times in many other places. Part of why the Holocaust was allowed to happen was because of people who didn't know that it was happening, weren't in a position to prevent it without themselves getting executed for even attempting it, something that did considerably more to prevent regular Nazis who did not believe in Nazi ideology from trying to save Jewish people than ignorance like Bruno's, but Bruno's ignorance is what we're focused on for this entire story. Like, there are characters, we have, in this movie, we have Bruno's grandmother and Kotler's father both disagree with the party, and it's really not focused on very much. We spend no time with Kotler's father. I'm not necessarily saying we had to, because they accomplish other things, but only very little time with Bruno's grandmother, and instead focus all this time on Bruno learning about it and asking these questions, like saying, why are you doing this to people who are being forced to do something awful and then killed afterwards? It's simply, you could so easily have changed, the story. I mean, let's see, and people who were heard but refused to believe, then, entire boats full of Jewish people fleeing Nazis were sent back by other countries where they were killed, and this exact thing is happening to countless refugees to this date. Some conservative politicians will fight to enact policies that make things worse in other countries, leading to many people fleeing, and then they turn around and demonize refugees who are literally running for their lives. And I did think it worked, the fact that, no adults truly listen to Bruno and actually believe him. That is a problem. There is, all over the world, a lot of children simply are not listened to. This movie reminds me of a couple of the many heartbreaking parts of Schindler's List. The Jewish girl in red who is later, we see her fate. I suppose I won't give it away here for, it was the Holocaust, so you can probably deduce it. That movie didn't think it was necessary to kill an Aryan child to get sympathy. It felt it was enough to show the Jewish children died. And another part of, Jewish people being removed from the ghetto, and a gleeful German girl, I would guess maybe 5 years old, saying, "Goodbye, Jews." Now, obviously, she didn't know what would happen to them, but she was still glad to see them go. That is a much more realistic depiction of German Aryan children's response to Jewish people in pain. And finally, if you want a better movie that touches upon some of the same themes, for a movie where at least one of the leads is a young male living in Nazi Germany losing their innocence, I recommend the 1959 The Bridge. Less so the remake. The original is better. And do note, The Bridge is not okay to watch for teens, only adults. The teens in it believe in Nazism, like a huge chunk of the a significant chunk of the German people back then, but still otherwise retain their innocence. And the movie, and even better book, are not expecting you to agree with Nazism. No one should agree with Nazism. And that again, like, I'm not saying that media is the entire fault of it. Like, this is something that has been stoked by the far right for decades. I forget who noted it, but the Nazis didn't truly go away. They just went into hiding. But media like this is part of the problem, if not the biggest. And we see these teens face things that innocence shouldn't be able to survive. The movie Downfall features multiple Hitler youth who clearly believe in an innocent way in the cause, but over the course of the film, their belief is tested. Jojo Rabbit, and yes, I realize that came out after this one did, but it's far superior, and while it is possible that that movie could not have been made back when this one was, I think an argument could be made that it still would be better if this movie wasn't made. That is also about a child, this one 10, in Nazi Germany, meeting a Jewish person for the first time, potentially losing his innocence, realizing the world is more complicated than he thought. Maybe at least one adult male that he respects is not a good person. It has the courage to admit, yeah, this 10-year-old would be an avowed Nazi, or at least be trying to become one. That was so heavily encouraged by the authorities. And certainly, at the very, very least, a child back then would have heard a lot of propaganda and most likely believed it, given that it was told to him by authority figures he trusts on other things. We also have the counterfeiters' realistic depiction of life in a concentration camp, including that some have it better than others, R-rated and earns it. All Quiet on the Western Front, both the, I would say, 1929 version and the 1970s version. And yes, I realize these are both about World War I, not II. Both also give a more realistic depiction of innocence when a world war and human rights violations are going on close by. And yes, I realize some of them were not outlawed when they happened. So let's see. I suppose that does bring us to the, yeah. I'm going to try to keep the rest of this more or less chronological. So, yeah, the very opening, they do a good job making clear, Bruno is really going to miss playing with the other children, which is, of course, crucial for us to believe that he, because at first he and Shmuel can't really play, whether he brings football or, the checkers, I think is what they're playing. It doesn't really work that well, but he just so badly wants to socialize with, a boy his own age that's, yeah. And I think the, yeah, it's genuinely potentially effective when Bruno's grandmother, says, "Do you still believe in this? Maybe it was my fault. Maybe I shouldn't have had you dress up for plays when you were a child. Does it still make you feel important?" or something along those lines, because that is part of the psychology. This is, again, something you don't have to take my word for. You can look at, like, there is research that proves a big part of fascism is the pageantry. It's making someone who used to feel weak feel powerful again. And I do really appreciate that they have her. They don't give her much to do or say, but what little she does is so cutting. She 100% realizes it. And it is powerful to see a mother ashamed of her child, and feeling like maybe she screwed up. Maybe that's why he's like he is now. And I think that does bring us to... So when they... Let's see. Yeah, not very long after they arrive. At first we're seeing, I think it's nearly every time we see Gretel, at least when she's not at the party. At the party, not. But nearly every time she is she's got her dolls. She's playing with them or carrying them or something. And also, I don't really know the correct terms, but the way she has her pigtails is different, and once Helist arrives, suddenly she's not playing with the dolls, and we see this imagery that I believe, was it Big Joel who pointed out also, it's very evocative of a mass grave, and I do appreciate, the idea that an 8-year-old would not be able to understand, like, it might be too much for an 8-year-old. Again, I'm not a child psychologist. I can imagine it would be too much for an 8-year-old to be told about mass graves of humans, but seeing dolls like that, because to an 8-year-old, dolls are still, important. And I'm not saying there's something wrong with them being important to you when you are an adult, but that is a subject that Savvy Writes books can explain significantly better than I. But yeah, we also see at one point Helist is teaching them, and she is braiding, I think it's called, her pigtails so that she looks like the Hitler Youth girl on the propaganda poster that she now has in her room. And he tells her, your dolls, and she's like, they're for children. I have to become an adult. And yeah, the Hitler Youth, there is definitely some aspects here where it is quite accurate. As mentioned earlier, it is important that we, teach children empathy, anti-bigotry, anti-fascism, that they should be against dictatorships. And I appreciate that it can be difficult because sometimes, you cannot explain to a child why they have to do the thing that you're telling them to do. There has to be some level of authority there for adults taking care of the child. Otherwise, it might not be safe. But yeah. And, the dictators and bigots know this as well. That's part of why, you see American far-right conservatives trying to destroy public schools, and yeah. You also have a lot of indoctrination of Israeli children. The government wants them to join the IDF and hate Palestinians. I don't think I'm going to describe it, but you can still find, you can find online examples of what is shown and taught to Israeli children about Palestinians. And if one can appreciate, yeah, if you're taught this as the primary thing about Palestinians, yeah, you'll mentally dehumanize them, of course. That's, yeah. And I think that does bring us to the, yeah, and there's that shot where there's two, actually. There's, we have another striking image along with the mass grave of dolls. We also have the part where Bruno is sitting on the stairs and the I forget what that's called, but it's in front of him and it looks almost like the bars of a cell. He is in prison here. Note that when he was in Berlin, he was running around and playing with other children. Now he's alone behind bars, and there's a shot where we see him from the front, and so yeah, there's a part where we see it's sort of an over the shoulder, and we see how the bars essentially create distance between him, his mother, and his sister. They are more receptive to this, so he is isolated, hence why his relationship with Shmuel develops, again, despite aforementioned what's the word? The limitations of their interactions. And I think that is around the time where we meet Kotler. So, yeah, Rupert Friend just nails it. Honestly, I think his performance might be the single most spot on, though David Thewlis is also, phenomenal. And again, like, Vera's, at this point, I'm just naming them, but yeah, Asa, who plays Bruno, is also, and Shmuel, the actor who plays Shmuel, they are all great, but Rupert Friend is one of the ones who most dominates your attention, and the fact that simultaneously he does like Bruno. He does want to cheer up Bruno. He calls him little man and musses up his hair and such. And at one point he lifts his hand, reaches out to do that, and Bruno starts to back away because he thinks that he's about to be hit, because he knows about Pavel and Shmuel being hit by Kurt. Now I suddenly can't remember his last name. And yeah, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. He simply, he is intense a lot of the time, even when he's making jokes. There's the thing about the spare tire. And the way that he so smoothly transitions between talking in this relatively gentle, for a Nazi soldier, gentle way to Bruno and Gretel, and then he shouts commands at Pavel. And let's see, I think that does cover, but while I try to remember what's next, I'll just briefly note. So in the book, there is this bit where Hitler himself comes to visit, and Bruno doesn't understand who he is. He's just like, wow, this guy's really rude. He doesn't say that, but he thinks it to himself, and he thinks that the mustache looks like he started to shave and then stopped. I forget the reason. He assumes he liked Ava Brown much better because she was nice, which I believe is historically accurate. It feels really kind of self-congratulatory. It feels like you want the children reading the book, elbowing each other and going like, oh, okay, that's the Fuhrer. He would so hate, Adolf Hitler would be so mad if a child was, describing him in that way. And it's like, listen, this is not the producers. You really are not doing a good job of this. I'm not personally opposed to the idea of laughing at Hitler and the Nazis. This is something explored remarkably well in already excellent, very talented, longtime leftist YouTuber Lindsay Ellis's video on the producers. But this it's the wrong place and way to do it. Yeah, I think the next thing is when so he sees, he thinks it's a farm, and that's when the mother finds out about it, and she has issue with it and tells him not to go near there. And that, again, it's a place where they are trying to confront this idea, the people who knew that the Holocaust was happening and didn't do anything. And yeah, I think I've said everything I want. I just want to acknowledge that's one of the places where it is brought up. I think, yeah. So he, they managed to make this tire swing, and he, does as children sometimes do, and is not quite careful enough with it, and ends up, it's his knee that's it. And Pavel carries him in, bandages it up. And I did think they did a really great job making it clear Pavel does actually care, because this is one of those things where you could easily have had some people walk away thinking, oh, so he's worried that he's going to be blamed for it. He doesn't actually care. He hates Jewish. There's a lot of bigots who assume that the people they are bigoted towards are also bigoted towards them, which sometimes, yeah, but if it's a bigger problem when the bigot has actual institutional power. When bigotry is systematized, that's when it's much more, yeah, it's so frustrating when members of the majority, when it comes to race or ethnicity, the so in white majority countries, white people try to pretend like, oh, we are just as oppressed as the people that we and our ancestors oppressed. Just ridiculous. To be clear, I'm not saying that every white person oppresses, actively, but we do have privilege that we have to acknowledge and check so that we can make the world a better place. Instead of whining about how, oh, it's not our fault. Like, yeah, I mean, the Vikings were not my fault, but they were my ancestors. So, yeah, it's important that we not let something like that happen again. And wherever we see it happening today, we speak out against it and we try to apply pressure. The, BDS, I believe they are called, boycott, divest, and sanction, they are extremely important in helping to stop the genocide in Gaza carried out by the Israeli government. Now, yeah, and the little moment where, you have the thing about, you're not a doctor, and he explains he was, and that again, like, it is important for young people to know, yeah, like, they were members of society, a number of them, some were war heroes from World War One. They were well integrated into society, and some of them were shocked. They had no idea, they couldn't have imagined that one day they would just be rounded up and then first put in a ghetto, then concentration camps, and so many of them even, killed, murdered. And that's something we're seeing ICE do right now. And obviously Palestinians are not even allowed to be part of, there's a, apartheid state there. They are kept away from Israeli Jewish people, and that's then used to say, oh, look, they're not even part of society. Yeah, because they're being prevented from it. Like, there's so many cishet white conservative men in America who choose to not help make society better, but rather try to make it worse out of selfish reasons, and not, yeah, I think but yeah, and the mother character even thanks Pavel for it. Which again, it's this thing of like the fact that, so the thing they're doing is that she gradually, it becomes more and more difficult for her to be okay with it. And I mean, at least ultimately there is that thing about she's going to move away from Auschwitz, and the kids are coming with, so that they're not, because she hates what is being done to them right now. And that is, of course, the very most that she could possibly do in that situation. So I do want to make it clear, I don't think her character is pointless. I just wish there was more depth to her, and that it didn't feel like she's kind of written as, just, again, it doesn't feel completely authentic. Yeah, I think that covers that. So yeah, he goes out and finds, and sees Shmuel, and they start talking, and I'm so relieved that they toned down a lot of, because like, Bruno in the book just does not seem to think before he speaks so much of the time, and says and does such ridiculous things when it comes to Shmuel and other, and Pavel, and it just, yeah. Right, and I also thought, the actors playing Jewish people, they really do strike a very impressive balance, because essentially, like, they can't just come out and say what they think about the way things are going. Shmuel perhaps less so. He does not hold back particularly, but the, Pavel and Maria obviously can't just come out and say it, because what if someone overhears them? And, Maria genuinely trying to cheer him up and make him happy. There's that thing where he says that he's bored every day, and she says something like, well, it's not going to become better by you not doing anything about it. Maybe there's something you could do. That is genuinely, like, she's essentially sort of nanny duty, and yeah, like, that's the kind of thing that you would say if you really do care about how the kid feels. Like, she could so easily point out, well, you realize me and, my people are suffering, many of us are being killed, that's significantly worse than boredom. Now, I think, yeah, I appreciate that the very first time we see Kotler, he's just staring intensely at Bruno. He doesn't even introduce himself right away, which of course, very soldier kind of thing. But it really means, like, even once he talks about, like, we understand better part of why he's so intense at the dinner when he explains, well, yeah, I mean, technically his father fled the country because he disagrees. He's anti-Nazi. And Kotler ends up paying the price for not reporting him. And I think, let's see, yeah, let's see, the part where I'm trying to make sure to not just repeat what Big Joel said. Yeah, I think that does bring us to the actual, yeah, them having supper, and Kotler is there, and yeah, grandmother is not going because of what's happening. And I appreciate the detail that, yeah, clearly off screen, because he says, let me talk to her. I know she's there. I can hear her. Obviously, right off screen, she's trying to whisper so the phone doesn't pick it up. Or I guess it's not impossible that she's talking loud. Like, she just doesn't want to talk directly. She doesn't want to hear his voice, but she wants him to hear, possible. But yeah, she's saying she's not coming. She doesn't want to go. She doesn't want to celebrate his, yeah, it was one thing back in Berlin. She, just made the remark, which, as mentioned, really, really well done there. But she does not want to go that close to Auschwitz when he has chosen to go there and be commandant. I think that does bring us to the, yeah, and that's when there's the conversation about, so, Kotler, what about your father? And he keeps, trying to be vague, and eventually admits, yeah, he went to Switzerland, and yeah. And as soon as Pavel makes one tiny little mistake, suddenly he's being beaten to death. And Kotler is clearly in part, and that again works really well, because that is true. Kotler, the Nazi, is projecting his own pain related to his family, not Jewish people, projecting that onto a Jewish person, acting like it's somehow the Jewish person's fault, and using it to justify violence against the Jewish person. And this is, again, that's something that happened, back then with Nazis. It's happened, it still is happening sometimes with conservative white Americans, abusing, minorities, and it is also part of what is happening in, Israel. Israelis blame, I've already mentioned that it is in part revenge for the Holocaust, the way they treat and even kill, starve, shoot, bomb, even children, hospitals. Yeah, taking out on the Palestinians who did not, yeah. I think that does bring us to the, right, and we have the, there's the that bit of Nazi propaganda about, how could one person do this? Well, here I don't feel comfortable saying that exact thing, but when he says when he says he's using singular form, and that's what's in the book, Jewish person, he's rephrasing that to just those first three letters of Jewish. He's saying that refers to all Jewish people, and this was something they did, and it's a common tactic for inspiring bigotry, acting like they're basically a hive mind, the Borg or something. And that, again, you see that, I try to be careful to specify I am not doing that towards, for example, the conservative far right. I'm primarily talking conservatives in general. The conservative far right, a lot of the time, really do not question. At most, you sometimes see if they fear they're losing power, they might backtrack or something. But yeah, I'm not saying all conservatives think the exact same thing. I wish they were not conservative. I think in its current form, conservatism is not really, in countries like America, I'm not saying the entire world, I don't know enough about the entire world, but in countries like America, I don't really think you can defend still being conservative. Like, just create a new branch. If you don't have to be progressive, I wish you were, but if you're not, just, yeah, create an offshoot, but don't be part of the, that they are using, they're saying that you're with them even if you aren't, as long as you call yourself a conservative. Every so often a new branch is created. A lot of the time when conservatives do so, it's an even worse branch. You could be the change that you want to see in the world. You could create a branch of conservatism that rejects all the harmful stuff and leaves behind something, I imagine. Hypothetically, at least. But yeah. And we have the really powerful line. If it was just one person doing this, I'm sure someone would put a stop to him. And this is, again, I believe the idea here is to say, because they don't, Herr List does not say, we Germans would have put a stop to him. They say someone would. Because it was not the German people who stopped Hitler, it was the other countries that fought against the Nazis. And I'm not saying that it would have... Listen, to be clear, there were Germans trying to stop Hitler. There were multiple assassination attempts. But yeah, ultimately it was others who stopped them. And again, it feels too pat on the head for me to really love the line, even though it is, of course, yeah, like, if one person is ruining everything, then, try to put a stop to that one person. Now, violence should only ever be the last resort. I'm not saying it was never necessary. It was indeed required to stop the Nazis in World War II, and Stonewall needed to happen. Shouldn't have had to, but did, for, LGBTQ plus rights. But yeah, I think that does bring... Yeah, and you have these, various people that he's told to trust, and some that he does trust, tell Bruno that, yeah, repeat propaganda about Jewish people. And he finds it, he's struggling to figure out how he feels about Shmuel. And I think that might cover the... yeah, I think the part where they show the propaganda film, I think you could have easily had a line where you said, one of them say, this will definitely convince Aryans that we're doing okay by Jewish people, and we don't need to convince them. That's what the trucks and trains are for, something like that, so that you avoided, I mentioned earlier, there were children who thought that Jewish people were volunteering to go into the camps because of the propaganda films. And I think that does bring us to the... let's see. Yeah, I thought the part where the mother, the Vera Farmiga character points out, so Kotler's father was not reported. He goes to the front. You didn't report your mother. You got a promotion. And I think that might more or less cover. Let's see. So there's the there's several times where Shmuel is hungry, and Bruno tries bringing chocolate, but I think the idea is he eats it all. I think that is what happens in the book, and that was also like Big Joel commented on that. And at one point he brings the bread, and there's a nice little intersection where, he says, I just have, Maria is not getting involved because she does not want any of this to end up hurting her. And, at the end of the day, I mean, okay, so he's bringing bread, like he's refusing, and he's also being rude, and, it's none of your business. Just, he's so much worse in the book. I'm really glad they toned it down. Anyway, he says, it's just books Herr List got me. And so she wants to see them because she wants to know what they're being taught. And then he says that he wants to tell the truth. And we think might be about the food, but he instead claims it's just adventure books because he does understand she doesn't mind that he brings those. It's Herr List who has issues with that. And I thought they did a good job when, there's the part where he gives Shmuel the food and Shmuel eats it basically as fast as he all can. And I thought the shot was just long enough that we really appreciate he is literally starving, but also not so long that we sit there thinking, this is just uncomfortable. Like, can we just, like, listen, we agree this was terrible. They shouldn't have been starved. Can we please move on? I thought they, for a PG-13. I'm not saying it would necessarily have been wrong. I'm saying, yeah. And let's see. I think that's another thing. I am of the opinion that when you deal with, I guess I already said it for the Holocaust, but war and the Nazis, I think a case could be made that a movie has to be rated R if it is not allegory. Otherwise, there's just stuff you cannot show that, Let's see. I think, so he says, maybe you could have supper with us. Shmuel says that's probably not going to happen. We're not allowed. And then one day he is there, to help, polish, and Bruno gets him food, and then Kotler catches them. And he is intimidating, and he is also, that is one spot where he is meaning to intimidate Bruno as well, but he is still calling him little man. And he asks, is this true, rather than like immediately assuming. And as soon as Bruno lies, he readily accepts it, even though like it's so much more credible that Bruno, who, like, listen, literally every adult that he has interacted with in this entire movie has heard at least one time where he either said that it didn't seem like Jewish people were that bad, or he seems to not understand the concept that they are bad. Like, of course he got him, like, what Jewish child would, that close to Auschwitz, would steal food and then just openly eat it in front of an Aryan child? Like, even if he was going to do something similar, don't you think he'd maybe hide or something? It doesn't make any sense, but, bigotry doesn't. It is inherently irrational. It is blaming a group of people for a problem that was not created by them, maybe not even worsened by them, in place of holding those accountable who actually did do the evil thing that it is understandable to be upset about. Like, the rich and powerful, many of them cishet white men, Christians, and the ones who are not those things are not inherently worse than the ones who are. They are actually destroying the world. AI is using up water. climate change is rendering parts of the world uninhabitable by human beings. People are literally dying even though they are working hard, or at least willing to, but maybe physically incapable of it, or maybe they just can't find a job because the rich keep cutting jobs and replacing them with machines. That's something. Let's see, I believe Luddite is the term. For the longest time, I thought Luddite meant like a silly person who just doesn't accept technology, which, as someone who, I've had access to a computer since I was a child. I have never lived in a place where I did not have access to a computer. I remember pre-internet, but yeah. So to me, that always seemed, silly, and that's also how it was presented to me by pop culture and such. And then, several years ago, I learned, Luddites, they were actually essentially unionists. Like, they were not against the concept of machines. They were against people losing their jobs to machines. And conservatives with power did what they do. They propagandized. They lied about it and said, these silly, silly people, they just don't understand. They're standing in the way of progress. We just have to fire them. And I think that does bring, but yeah, and it is genuinely like an effective, unpleasant scene when Kotler confronts the two children, and then, yeah, that whole thing and the various power dynamics at play there work well. And I think, because obviously, as soon as Bruno has lied, it's not like Shmuel can just say, no, I'm telling the truth. At that point, he just gives up, But he tried telling the truth because he trusted Bruno, and Bruno was too afraid of Kotler, so he did the wrong thing. And I also really appreciate that it acknowledges it was very much the wrong thing. He had a choice. Kotler called him little man, and listen, at the end of the day, what's the worst that's going to happen to Bruno from this? He's not going to be beaten to death like Pavel was. He's not going to be put in a concentration camp like Shmuel. He's going back to that as soon as this polishing is done, But yeah, sometimes kids can act out of selfishness, especially if they're afraid. So yeah, I haven't watched a Dune yet, so maybe I shouldn't be saying fear is the mind killer, but I do think that is such a perfect quote. It really does speak volumes. I will watch the, I am quite the fan of Denis Villeneuve. I am not 100% sure I'm going to watch the original based on some of the stuff I've heard about it. I feel bad that David Lynch was not allowed to make the movie he wanted to make because from what I've seen, let's see, Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, and The Elephant Man, when you let David Lynch cook, the man was a Michelin star deserving level chef. Just like wonderful. It's such a loss that he, I miss him. I think I might try to watch some more. I've heard really, really good things about, for example, Twin Peaks. I am not currently planning on doing videos on him. I'm not sure. I think that might be above my pay grade. Now, I think that does bring us to the... Yeah, and, for days, Bruno goes to the fence. Shmuel's not there. And one day he is there, and he's got his head bowed, and he slowly raises it, and you see, the bruise. And again, in part because it's PG-13, but that's maybe also just one of those things I'm not sure we need to see visually. I'm glad that this does not show him being hit. I don't know. Does that make me a hypocrite? I know I'm also criticizing the fact that it doesn't show quite enough. That's the thing. This movie, it shows a little bit too much, but also not quite enough at times, so just, yeah. Let's see. The, okay, wait. Not too much, sorry. I mean, sometimes it shows the right amount, but other times it holds back too much. The book, that's what I meant. The book does not show enough. I guess, secondly, the movie doesn't either. I'm confused. I think I need to just move on. The book includes things that I think really shouldn't be in there, and then holds back on other regards. And the movie does fare better overall. And yeah, so he apologizes and tries to make it up to him. And there's the thing about, his father's missing. And yeah, like there's some chance that his father has already been gassed, and now it's this other group that will be. And I think it works that I've already criticized the ending, but I will say I do think this thing of, we see him plan it, we see him, make the big sandwich, he's really trying to do right by Shmuel. This is more food than Shmuel has had access to in a long time. And, he drops the sandwich, and so, they can tell, okay, he must have been here, and they can also see the window open. And then they go there, and there's the hole that he dug, which is also, there's no way he would have been able to do that. And I just think it's wrong to so thoroughly downplay. Yeah. But yeah, so right, and we have the thing about, he puts on the pajamas and he covers his hair with the thing, and, mother and daughter and father, looking for Bruno, and he he yells out Bruno, and it is like, yeah, they've been everywhere. There's only one thing that could possibly have happened. I think it works that we don't actually see the face at all of the Nazi soldier who, carries out the executions, mass execution there. We see the gas mask, and he's pouring the thing, and then afterwards we see him, deal with the box after. We don't see him take off the gas mask. It is very dehumanizing, much like how they dehumanized the Jewish people in order to be able to do this. And yeah, I gotta say, of all the people, I try to have empathy for essentially everyone. I think, in a lot of cases, like if you're able to solve someone's problems, that's more likely to get them to improve their behavior rather than criticizing them. I try in these videos, I try to criticize people who I think there's a chance might listen, or people close to them who are open to listening, and because they're in this, bubble, they just aren't being exposed to a lot of this, information, these arguments. But executioners, especially ones killing so many, that they make it extremely difficult for me to empathize with them. So yeah, I very much approve there. I think that does cover, right, and the funeral. I'll briefly cover. The funeral itself is also this thing of, Vermiga tries to remove the thing. It's, says, she wouldn't want that, and, he just says, but he does, her husband, the widower, does want it there, and he physically restrains her from removing it, And let's see, yeah, and we have the part where she's essentially like regressing to childhood. She gets really drunk on wine. Not that that's okay for children, but that is part of what's happening there. But she's on the swing, and yeah, overall, I think Big Joel said what I just wanted to mention. That also stuck out to me as an image in this. And yeah, like, I'm on the edge of my seat during the scene where Kurt confronts the two children. I get a chill down my spine when, Kurt does anything intense, pretty much. Yeah, I think that covers, so that just leaves the very ending. And yeah, you have this thing of the, the family breaking down in more ways than one at the death of Bruno. And I also appreciate they definitely went as far as they could in showing it. They can't actually show them die on a PG-13. There's also, I don't think there's any real nudity, even though it's a room full of naked people. But the, let's see, I think brings up the, let's see. Yeah, so yeah, focusing on the door, and we hear commotion in there, and, we realize what's happening, and then the camera starts to pull away from the door. Now everything's quiet in there, and the image very slowly fades to black, to really have us sit with what just happened. And again, I think that does really sum up this movie, which, as I hope I've by now demonstrated, reflects in part in how it was received by various audiences, how important it is to make sure that people get the right information, accurate information about things like the Holocaust, slavery, the genocide in Gaza being carried out against Palestinians by the IDF. Because, like so many other things about this movie, it is ill-conceived in that it, part of the reason we saw it at all was because it happened to Bruno, and things that, what the movie shows is stuff that happens directly to him and stuff that affects him. So, Vera being told by Kotler, yeah, that's, those are Jewish people being burned, that affects her decision. That's part of why she ends up, that's why she takes such an interest in what is Hell is teaching them, and, ends up having, saying that they should move. But like so many things in this movie, it is ill-conceived, but technically competent. And it is necessary for us to confront that there are people who read this book, watch this movie, and think that this is an appropriate way to teach children who don't already know, things about the Holocaust. I appreciate that this could be used to help them process certain things, but it should not be the only source, because what happened in Nazi Germany, similar has happened since. In some cases is happening right now, and will continue to happen in the future if we are not sufficiently aware of what happened, how to see the signs, what can be done to prevent it from getting to this level, and how to fight the ones that are already happening.